A course isn't really properly finished without some sort of conclusion. Although in this case, it's something of an anti-conclusion, because this is really not the end of my journey or your journey in learning about the connections of human cultures and their environments. Indeed, that is one of the central conversations that we all have throughout our lives, and one of the central responsibilities we all have in our lives is to explore and understand and act responsibly towards those connections. So this is something of an anti-conclusion then, not an ending, but perhaps some final food for thought as you walk out of the specific door of my classroom, virtual or otherwise, and into bigger and better spheres. And hopefully spheres in which you feel at least a little bit better prepared given this class. I hope the small career prep activities we've done each week have been helpful. I hope the different paradigms have been helpful. I hope the case studies have been useful in getting you thinking and using tools that you can use in the real world, a real world that desperately needs us. But on that note of the real world that needs us, it is normal, it is natural for people when they spend a lot of time thinking about the environment or learning about environmental and cultural issues to come away with a certain amount of dejectedness, despair, even. Many people already came into this class with a certain amount of that, but sometimes the topics we talk about can further add to that as we talk about complex situations, often which involve significant environmental problems, and sometimes on top of that, or involved with that, significant human suffering as well. Everything from climate change and the effect it has on human communities in the Arctic to palm oil, sort of a fundamental commodity in our current economy and the effects that can have on indigenous groups in Southeast Asia, to the ways in which indigenous ontologies are often excluded in developments. And so, it's easy to walk away from all of this feeling somewhat depressed, and even more so when we also think about kind of global things, right? Ocean acidification, coral reef bleaching, climate change. It's easy to get upset, and understandably so. I remember one time as I was teaching one of these classes, environmental anthropology it was called, where I was teaching at the time, and gosh, it was a terrible classroom we were in. We had to teach like in this stadium of all things. It was just terrible. It was this like tiny little classroom that kind of seemed like it was more like a place where you would go over like plays with a basketball team, right? Because it was like in a stadium at the university where I was teaching at. Anyways, that's not really relevant to the story. But one of my students came up to me and basically, after we've talked about air pollution and climate change and species extinction and all these different things, and he sort of asks, man, like, do you have sort of any suggestions on sort of like hope for the future, right? Like he was kind of really bummed out. And I've thought about that a lot since then, sort of hope for the future. And it came up again this past week as I was talking to one of you in this class, and so I've just really been chewing on that concept. So I'd like to address this sort of final mini lecture towards that very topic. And so thus I've subtitled this, Why I Am an Optimist. And I am an optimist. I am not an optimist because I am some kind of naive idiot. I am aware. I could be better aware. We all could be better aware. But I am aware of many of, at least on some level, of many of the environmental challenges we face as a society, as well as, and as a global community, and the complexities and trade-offs and compromises inevitably of any solutions we may find. And so I'm not naive to these issues. I'm not naive to the pressing issues that we face in several environmental domains. But I would characterize myself nonetheless as an optimist. As an environmental anthropologist, I would say that I am an optimistic one. And I would like to share a few reasons why, in the hopes that these can help provide some inspiration, some hope, some counterbalance to any sort of lingering despair, and that we can leave on a note of, I think, positivity and hope, one that's not built on naivete, hopefully, but instead on, I think, some very reasonable reasons to hope. So I'd like to share 3 of mine. The first one is what I call the audacity of humanity. If you look at human beings, compared to many of our most similar genetically and physically animals, we are only moderately impressive. We're great at long-distance runners, but we, of course, have other things that are not very impressive. No canine teeth or claws, but of course we don't require them since we make tools. Well, I mean, we do have canine teeth, but they're rather unimpressive. So we're sort of just okay, I suppose, from that perspective, if you wanted to look at it in terms of a physically imposing animal. And yet, we started off in one environment. As far as physical anthropology is concerned, we started out in sort of an East African environment and have since spread into every single environment on Earth, up to and including the far Arctic and the far Antarctic, where we have some scientific settlements, and even now things like a space station in orbit. We've spread into such difficult to live places as the tundra, the taiga, the deep Amazonian rainforest, the steppe, the Siberia. We have found ways to adapt, ways to live in virtually every single environment on Earth, in grasslands and in deserts, in forests and in tundra, in the middle of the ocean and in places where water is exceptionally scarce. We have figured out how to live in those places, and we have gone from beings who sort of were barely starting to paint on cave walls, as in these Lascaux caves, to beings that, for example, could navigate in incredibly skillful ways across the Aleutian Islands and build up a culture of thousands of people in those islands who could navigate even in foggy weather due to incredibly sophisticated kayaks and ecological knowledge. We are a people who learned how to adapt across the world. And, part of that is a testament to the fact that long before any of us were born, humans stopped being solely a matter of shall we say, natural selection solely from outside forces, and started to be a species that, because of our ability to communicate, because of our ability to develop culture, now finds ourselves in a situation we are no longer confined to a single environment or even many environments. We instead are able to develop our own niche, right? Many of the species we've talked about this semester have relatively specific habitats or roles they can fill in the ecosystem, some more specific than others. But generally speaking, species have their own niches. Humans are unique in the sense that we design our own niches. We get to decide with each generation and with each land we inhabit what we want to be. Do we want to be hunters? What kind of hunters? Do we want to be fishers? What kind? Do we want to be gatherers? Of the many foods available, what will we gather? We never gather all of the things available. Do we want to be farmers? What kind of farmers? Small scale, slash and burn, rice paddy, major industrial with, GPS guided tractors? What do we want to be? How do we want to fit? And although there are of course physical limits to that, it is rather impressive and at the same time scary and terrifying and daunting and beautiful that we get to have some say in our niche. And I think that means that we can reinvent ourselves. And I think we've sometimes invented ourselves down very catastrophic paths, but I think that also means we can reinvent ourselves along very good paths. And so I believe in the audacity of humans. And I believe ultimately that we'll make it through many of these environmental problems. I'm not one of these doomsday predictionists that think we're heading towards sort of human extinction. You can go on Reddit or other social media sites and hear all sorts of those sorts of predictions. I don't believe it. I think we're here and we're sticking around. I think the question is what kind of a world we want to stick around in for future generations of both ourselves and other creatures. And I hope we'll be something a little bit better than cockroaches. And I use that as a metaphor. I don't actually mean to insult cockroaches, although they are one of the very few animals I find scary. But what I mean by that is I hope that we're a little bit something better than just, something that can adapt to destruction and towards scavenging and thrive in disaster places. I hope instead we are beings that can lead to a flourishing environment for us all. And I think we can reinvent ourselves in that direction if we truly use the tools of culture and society that we have by virtue of being human. So I guess I'm a little bit of a human exceptionalist after all. And it's worth pointing out that was a sort of a story from the perspective of physical anthropology, human evolution. But there are many other origin stories from many other traditions that tell other kinds of origin stories. And it is interesting how many of those sacred origin stories in different spiritual traditions across the world, different cultures, to one degree or another, have an idea of human beings as having some kind of a place in the world, that we are not sort of pure accidents or abominations or something, but there was a process, right? In the Navajo creation story, Ardene Bahane, that there was a series of rising through lower worlds by which the holy people became more advanced, and that eventually humans were the outgrowth of a very, very long process by which the world was made safe for them through the actions of heroic beings of the past. Dreamtime stories of Aboriginal Australians, they connect them to a landscape in a very ancestral and real way. Hindu stories of cyclical time, of different types of creation from divine beings, Christian stories and the idea of humans as sort of tending a garden, as it were, and having that kind of a relationship with creation. I think in our various different cultures we have symbolic roots, stories, narratives that tell us, that also provide a perspective, right? I think physical anthropology suggests that we are not outside of nature, we evolved within it. Although we are unique, we are also part of it. And I think many creation stories of different spiritual traditions suggest that we have a role as well. And I think that across the world, we can draw on diverse cultural traditions to find inspiration to make the tough decisions for sustainability. And I think you would be surprised. Sometimes cultural traditions can matter very little to people, but other times they can affect our decisions in profound ways. I've talked before about Jain monks and nuns choosing a life of active veganism and indeed sweeping the ground before them and straining the air to avoid harming small insects and things. I'm not suggesting we all go to those lengths by any stretch. I am not a vegan. I very much enjoy the eating of animals, particularly that I've caught through fishing. But what I'm suggesting is that you might be surprised how powerful culture can influence our environmental choices. I hope that I've shown that this semester. I hope you've seen that. And so we have roots we can draw on in cultures, not just spiritual ones, though I use that example, but cultural ideas of what is enough, cultural ideas of saying, this is good, I have enough, I don't need to accumulate. The idea that we need to accumulate endlessly is a cultural idea, and it's not one that's always existed, and it's one that we can develop alternatives to. Reason number 3 for my hope is that, and this is something that living in Alaska in particular has really reinforced for me and just further taught me. But when we talk about environmental issues, it's very often not zero-sum, and it's very often not black and white, and it's very often situations in which people on multiple sides can make arguments for their case. That doesn't mean all arguments are equally valid, and it doesn't mean there's not bad people with bad purposes in this world. There is 100% people that solely want to make a profit, no matter what the environmental cost. But there are also legitimately people who have different views of what an environmental decision or development would do, and have different reasons they may support it that may be not unreasonable. I started the lecture talking about the different perspectives in Anwar, and among other things, indigenous communities that have come out both for and against oil drilling in that area, and have raised, compelling reasons on both sides, and have argued compelling cases for the environmental safety or lack thereof of this. Personally, I'm a very cautious person, particularly with the behavior of wildlife, and so I would be one that would be very cautious towards something like this and take more the side of those who worry about the environmental harms. But I can see that there are legitimate arguments made on the other side, and I bring that up to suggest that with a lot of these environmental issues that we face, I hope part of what this semester has shown is that oftentimes we are talking not just about sort of a simple bad guys, good guys, but instead a situation in which people have complex needs. They want a landscape that is meaningful to them. They want to connect to their landscape. They have spiritual connections. They have emotional connections. They have philosophical connections. They love the lands that they inhabit. They have a sense of place and meaning with their place. But people also need to make a living, and people also have political limitations placed on them by colonialism, by being in a global south country. There's a lot going into these kinds of discussions, and so they're complex. And weirdly enough, that complexity gives me hope. The complexity teaches me that I definitely don't always have the answer for every single environmental issue, what the 100% right answer is. And very often, the more I learn, the more I realize that probably am very far from having the one right answer, and that we would need to get many, 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 many people involved to try to even come to a rightish answer. And so it's precisely in that complexity that I find inspiration, that even if it doesn't always seem like it's going my way, as I think of these different things, that maybe my way isn't always 100% the way. And that might sound a little bit of an odd statement to make. Of course, nobody would think that, right? And yet sometimes we act like it is. Sometimes we act like we know what should happen in every single environmental situation. And I think it can be very helpful to have humility and to realize that these issues are far more complex than we sometimes give them credit for. And that can give us a certain amount of comfort in knowing that perhaps it's not all as black and white, and therefore not as dire and apocalyptic as we sometimes think it is. In fact, I think it's far more gray, and far more complexities and trade-offs and compromises and tough, but hopefully also empathetic decisions we have to make collectively about our lands. And a fourth and final reason that I hope because of people like you. And I know that's such a cheesy thing to say at the end of a semester, but it's really true, right? 20 people chose to take this class this semester. Actually, more like 23 because of the grad students. That's just the undergrads. And indeed, it's been my experience in teaching courses like this over several years that consistently we have, these courses tend to fill up. We tend to either fill them all the way up or most of the way up. And I think you could probably see similar trends in other environmental classes across the university. I can't speak to them, but I can speak to the ones I teach. And I think that inspires me because it shows me and reminds me that we have dozens, hundreds, thousands, millions of people across the world, both in the world and also, again, dozens, hundreds, thousands right here in our local communities that care about these issues, that are passionate about these issues, that want to work on these issues. And anytime there's that sheer number of human beings, I'm inspired that beautiful things can happen. If we can get coordinated enough to do silly dance routines on TikTok and make those viral, then I certainly think we can get coordinated enough to make positive change if that many people care. And so, there's a quote that's often wrongly attributed to Margaret Mead. It's not from Margaret Mead, but it's never doubt that a small committed group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I would actually say that in this case, it's not a small group. Indeed, it's a growing group of people that care about these issues. And we don't all agree with each other, and there's diverse perspectives within that. But the fact that there's that many people who do care, I think, is very inspiring. And so, where does that leave us then? I think kind of about moving forward. And also we need to kind of move backwards. It's not always about progressing forward, but sometimes looking to our roots as human beings, looking to past traditions and practices and seeing what we can learn from those. And also moving sideways, learning from each other, learning from diverse cultures around the world. I think it's not going to be one set of solutions that's going to see us through this day. We're going to need to band together on this one and fight the tide together, not individually. But, I do want to return to a concept from the first week of class. I sometimes say, does a whale, or I'm going to use an endangered rhino now. Instead, does an endangered rhino care about Foucault or Marx or Durkheim or Donna Haraway or any of these various theories, or Mary Douglas, or Sherry Ortner, or Pierre Bourdieu, or any of these theorists that we make you learn about, like, does this actually matter to real animals that are really in danger, like rhinos that are vulnerable to pollution? These are Sumatran rhinos. They're freaking adorable. There's a little calf that was born about a month ago. That was like a miracle. These births happen very rarely. It's exciting. Anyways, does an endangered rhino care? And I would say surprisingly maybe. Well, first of all, I think we've seen that there are various worldviews that would say that animals are far more sentient than we give them credit for. But whether or not that's true, I don't think they probably read Foucault in their spare time. They've probably got more important things to do. But I think nature, right, the community of living things, which includes ourselves, needs us to be intelligent and thoughtful, to bring all the possible analytical skills that we can to the table in understanding why people make the bad environmental decisions they do and how we can make better ones. And I think these theories and these concepts from the course, I hope at least a few of them have struck you and have been useful to you, and that you can carry them forward into the work that you do to be more thoughtful and less simplistic, which is something we all need to be. And yet, not just tell simple narratives of good guys, bad guys, but instead tell complex but ultimately true stories about what's really going on the ground, which sometimes does involve calling out bad guys. So we need to be theoretically astute, we need to be sophisticated intellectually, we need to be playing with big ideas. And yet at the same time, nature also needs us to be grounded and practical and hopeful. I think nature, as it were, needs you to know great theory, but nature also needs you to compost. Nature also needs you to walk when you can, rather than drive if possible, or cycle. I think nature also needs you to dispose of your waste properly. I think nature also needs you to reduce your waste. There's about a gajillion things you can do in your personal life, many of which I don't do nearly enough of. I am a hypocrite if there ever was one on these issues, so don't be like Professor Dunstan. Do something practical and good today. Take the next step today. If nothing else, you'll feel better. But in addition to feeling better, you are actively taking part in what kind of a culture you want to create. Small steps may do very little, but small steps start creating a pattern of culture where other people see those small steps and likewise feel confident taking steps. So take the first step today. And that is what I want to leave you with. So thank you very much for your time and attention today. And this was my final lecture.